I want to add on a supplement to this video, but I want to add it on to the beginning regarding the inspection. To the extent that you're able, and to the extent that the buyer and seller are willing to agree, there are some repairs that it might be a good idea for you to just fix with money. Meaning it might be a good idea, if the seller agrees, to pay, for example, maybe $1,000 for some repair XYZ. You know, it depends on what the repair is. Maybe there's some flashing that's missing, or maybe there's the fascia board is messed up, or something like this. Because typically, not always, but typically the seller is going to try to do that as cheap as possible. They're going to try to do it, or they're going to try to get their friend to do it on the cheap. And the buyer is sometimes, in fact, oftentimes never happy with the quality of work. And I've seen this happen over and over again. So to the extent that you're able, to the extent that the lender will allow you, and to the extent that both parties agree, sometimes it's better to fix those things with money. Here's one thing you don't want to do. You don't want to put in the amendment, in lieu of repairs, seller shall pay buyer an additional $1,000. You don't want to do that. You want to leave it vague in there because the lenders tend to get a little sideways about that. So all you would do in that case would be seller shall pay an additional $1,000 to the buyer in the form of seller paid closing costs, something like that. And you can talk to the compliance department about how best to word that. And on to the major part of the video. Thanks. What's up, Keller Williams Realty Partners, coming to you with video 3 from the 5-part series on the buyer's point of view. Today I want to talk a little bit about the inspection. Just about I think every house I've ever sold, a buyer chose to do an inspection with the exception of one. I had one guy who was adamant that he didn't want to do one, so most of them will do one. One thing I didn't include in this type up here in the email is they're going to run you anywhere between about $500, $600, sometimes $700 and $800 depending on the size of the house. And of course there may be more additional fees if they decide to do other things. So and I'll just start with the reading. You can use my preferred inspector or someone you know and trust. They want to make sure the buyer uses whoever they'd like. I have a really good inspector. We also have a really good inspector that is a preferred vendor in our office. You're welcome to use those guys as well. Back to the reading. Regardless of who you use, and again this is to the buyer, regardless of who you use, I would suggest meeting him or her for the last hour of the inspection so they can tell you what they found. It's a good idea to at least have the buyer go out there. You can go out there too. Some agents go out for the last part as well. I have done both. If I have time, I go out. If I don't have the time, or if I've got another appointment, I usually let the inspector handle that because they are going to write up a report. That's entirely up to you. Of course, they will write up the report and give both you and I a copy. They're going to give the agent a copy, and they're going to give the buyer a copy. So many of the items he or she will find will probably be small and typical of the home's age. Look, there's different philosophies on this, but you as a buyer's agent have to kind of make sure you know what your philosophy is on items that you're going to send. If you're buying a house from 1986, my suggestion would be not to send all the small little items in for the buyer, or excuse me, the seller to repair. I would just focus on the large things. It completely depends on the buyer. You probably want to set some expectations up front to let them know that you're probably, look, I'm not going to be sending every small little thing the inspector finds, because the report, and again, especially for a first-time home buyer, it's going to be 40, 50, 60 pages. And a lot of times it freaks them out. It's important to note that to set those expectations for that buyer up ahead of time, that the inspection is going to be fairly long, and there's going to be a lot of stuff in there that we're not going to ask for. Going back to the reading, hopefully there will be nothing too drastic to make us walk away from the sale. Speaking of, what we're really looking for are major repair items. You know, roof that we didn't know about had a problem, a foundation issue, maybe the deck is all messed up and not built correctly. Now, keep in mind, the plan isn't at the making of this video, it's 2026. We're not going to try to bring everything up to 2026 code. That'd be almost impossible for any house older than 10 years old or even 5 years old. But we do want to make sure the deck was actually built properly. There are going to be some things on that deck, for example, that aren't up to code if the house is a little bit older. But we want to try to make these repair requests as simple and as necessary as possible. One thing to keep in mind, and then back to the reading, just remember the sellers are under no obligation to fix anything should we ask for repairs. They literally do not have to fix anything at all. They could tell us, look, the house it is what it is. It worked perfectly fine for us, and we're not fixing anything. And by the way, it's also important to note that there is no recourse on the amount of money you spend for the inspection. So your buyers need to know that if they go and they spend $700 on the inspection and it comes back and there's something they refuse to fix and they have to terminate, the buyer's on the hook for that money. They're going to pay that money before the inspector goes out, likely. So back to what the sellers will do. Sometimes they do and sometimes they don't fix items. It just depends on the seller and the market. If we're in a particularly hot seller's market, again, sometimes they won't fix anything. And sometimes they'll fix everything you ask. So it just depends. For a particularly in-demand home that has multiple offers, or a home that's less than $300,000, the seller may not elect to do anything. Sometimes there is so much demand for a home that the seller will just move on to the next buyer. I had one during the hot market, and this was back in 2016, and the market wasn't quite as hot as it was in 21, but it was fairly hot. And we contracted on a house that had multiple offers. We were able to get there first, and they accepted our offer. And when we sent over the repair amendment or the amendment to address concerns to fix these items, he said, look, I've got a backup offer. We'll fix one thing, but we're not going to fix these other things you asked for. So you need to be prepared for that, and you need to prepare your buyer for it. Again, back to the reading. If we do ask for items to be addressed or fixed, and the seller agrees, you are welcome to have your inspector go out for a re-inspection. Look, that may not be a necessary cost for you. We can just go out and kind of eyeball and make sure they did something right. But you are welcome to have that inspector go out and re-inspect, but it's not going to be free. They usually charge $150 to go out for an hour to make sure everything's okay again. Re-inspection is also an option if you want to have a pro look at the house one last time. Of course, we can eye check that the repairs were made as well. Most buyers elect not to do the re-inspection, but should you decide in favor of one, the cost is usually around $150. And again, that may be a little bit more. It just depends on the inspector and how busy they are. Now, here's one thing I need you to keep in mind. Need to make sure you express this to your buyers. And it's back to the reading here. Even the best inspectors miss material defects from time to time. Most system functionality is hidden behind walls and other impediments and cannot be seen. So I would prepare your buyers that, look, my inspector is good or your inspector may be good, but there may be things they missed that may not be found out for months, maybe even years later. So it's important that they know that a good inspector is really good and good to do, but they may miss things. In addition, complete cycles of some of the systems will not be run. Back to the reading. For example, it is difficult to test the cooling portion of the HVAC or the air conditioning in cold weather. If it's 32 degrees outside, it's going to be difficult for just the run-of-the-mill inspector to understand if the HVAC is working or not. The HVAC system will be tested, but not to the extent that a certified HVAC technician would. So generally what's going to happen is the inspector is going to check what's called temperature differentials from a return vent and a supply vent. And usually, I can't remember what the numbers need to be, somewhere I think between 15 or 20. But anyway, they'll explain that. But that's really mostly what they're going to do. And in addition to that, they're going to write up in the report, they're going to say it's recommended that you have an HVAC technician to do further testing. And sometimes that freaks out the buyer when there's absolutely nothing wrong with the HVAC at all. And the reason why they're saying that, they're doing that for liability reasons, because they're not hooking hoses up to it and checking pressures and all this. Most likely they're not going to be doing that. In order for that to take place, you're going to have to hire or pay an actual HVAC technician to come out and look at it. And it just depends on how much work or how much money the buyer wants to spend. Most people just have the HVAC checked out by the regular inspector, and some people choose to pay a little bit more money and have an actual HVAC person come out and look. I would recommend that. It's going to cost you a little bit extra, but just know that it's not a thorough check from your regular inspector. And again, that's just one example of the HVAC. Okay. Back to the reading. Appliances like dishwashers and ovens and ranges will be checked to make sure they are operational, but an entire cycle will not be run and temperatures will not be measured. So here's an example. Some inspectors will come in, and the minute they get there, they run a full cycle on the dishwasher. Some of them won't do that. They're just gonna check to make sure it'll turn on. In addition, they may check the oven to make sure the eyes turn on or the oven's actually heating up. But if the oven says, for example, 350 degrees, is it actually up to 350 degrees? They're not going to measure that. So it's not going to be a very, very thorough inspection of those appliances. So it's important to know that too. Sump pumps, for example, that are in basements are difficult to check. Some people won't touch them. Now, what some inspectors will do is they'll go in there and they'll unplug the float portion of that device, and they'll plug it in to make sure it's working. But some people they won't touch those. So it's important to know that. The long story short is there may be things the inspector misses no matter who you use. If the home is on septic, it probably will not be accessed during the regular home inspection. So if it's on septic, you may want to have a septic person come out, as long as the seller will allow it, and crack the top on that septic to make sure it's working okay. In addition, some inspectors they'll use a sewer scope, and they'll check the main sewer line to make sure roots haven't grown into it or there isn't, hasn't cracked or anything like that. But some inspectors won't do that. So you need to make sure you're having a conversation with your buyer to make sure they're having a conversation with the inspector to see what they are and what they are not doing. My suggestion to you as a buyer's agent is to never be responsible for what the inspector is or isn't going to do. The buyer needs to own that portion of their reality and get in touch with the inspector and find out exactly what they're going to do. Have them shop around for a day. It may be worth the time. Now, the inspector I use is really good about this stuff. He's willing to talk to them, but some of the bigger companies, they don't have the time or they don't do that. So it's good to have the buyer have a very thorough discussion with the inspector. Now, for example, a separate septic inspection that may run $250 to $400. It may be more, it may be a little bit less, but if they're going to come out and do that, you need to make sure the buyer knows there's going to be an extra cost, and if they're going to dig that up, they've got to get the approval from the seller. So there is no end to the amount of additional inspections you can do. You can do termite, radon, septic, have an HVAC guy come out and hook up hoses and check pressures, have a roofing guy come out. I mean, I've seen all kinds of different additional inspections. And again, it's a matter of how much money does the buyer want to spend, because the buyer has to pay for all this, and how much time and effort are they willing to put into it. Most buyers elect to do the overall inspection and they just leave it at that. Also, should you desire a termite inspection or letter, it will be separate as well. Some companies will go ahead and offer that service for free. They'll have a termite person come out and do the termite letter to make sure there isn't any damage, and some of them don't. That's a conversation the buyer needs to have with their individual inspector. Okay, and so that does it for inspections. Again, this isn't all encompassing, but this is about 90% of the stuff you'll see. And thanks for watching.